That's how friends described Anni Dewani. Before her name became a global headline, she was just this vibrant 28-year-old woman, absolutely full of life. And I think it's so important that we start right there, with the person at the very heart of this story. Her story really does start like a fairy tale, but it tragically turned into a real-life horror show. Today, we're going to dive into the case of Anni and Shrien Dewani, a couple just married whose honeymoon in Cape Town, South Africa ended in a shockful murder that truly captivated the entire world. And that's the big question, right? It's the question that sits right at the center of this whole tragedy. I mean, this trip was supposed to be the beautiful beginning of a new life together, but instead it just unraveled into this incredibly complex web of accusations and international legal battles. So how did it all go so terribly wrong?
Okay, so let's get to know the couple themselves. Annie was this bright engineer, originally from Sweden, from a really loving Indian-Swedish family. And Shrien, he was a successful businessman over in the UK. They meet in London, fall in love pretty quickly, and they have this absolutely spectacular, lavish wedding in Mumbai. Literally just days later, they're off on their honeymoon.
Their destination was South Africa. But on the night of November 13th, 2010, in a township called Gugulethu, right outside Cape Town, their dream trip became an absolute nightmare. So according to the first reports, here's how it all went down. It's around 11 p.m. and their taxi gets ambushed. The driver is forced out. Then, a little while later, Shrien says he was pushed out of the moving car, but Anni, she was still inside with the hijackers. The next morning, police find the taxi. It's just been abandoned. And inside, they make the most devastating discovery imaginable. Annie's body is in the back seat. She'd been killed by a single gunshot to the neck.
But right away, the crime scene was just weird. It raised a ton of red flags. This didn't seem like your typical tragic robbery. All of Annie's valuables, her handbag, her jewelry, they were all still there. And that led investigators to a really critical question. If this wasn't about robbery, then what was it about?
And that one question, well, it sent investigators down a path that would soon send shockwaves around the entire world. The whole case was about to take a turn that, honestly, no one saw coming. So get this, just a few days after Annie's murder, South African police arrest a few guys, including the taxi driver, a man named Zola Tongo. And what they said? It was an absolute bombshell. They claimed this was no random hijacking. No, they alleged it was a murder for hire, a hit, orchestrated by Annie's brand new husband, Shrien. And just like that, the entire story splits into two completely different realities. On one side, you have Shrien Dewani's story. He's the grieving widower, a lucky survivor of a terrifyingly violent crime. And on the other side, you have the accused killers themselves, pointing the finger right back at him. You can imagine that accusation kicked off this massive international legal saga. Shrien went back to the UK, and what followed was a grueling 4-year battle, with South African authorities fighting to get him extradited to stand trial for murder. Now, the prosecution's case was hanging almost entirely on the words of the men who were already involved. The taxi driver, Zola Tongo, he cut a plea deal, a shorter sentence in exchange for testifying against Shrien. But there was a huge problem. The stories from these key witnesses, well, they kept changing, which raised some really serious questions about whether you could believe anything they said. And when the trial finally happened in 2014, the prosecution's whole argument just started to fall apart under cross-examination. Their star witnesses had these huge holes and inconsistencies in their stories, and some of the things they claimed, they just didn't match the actual physical evidence from the scene. And then, in a conclusion that just stunned everybody, the judge made a call. Before the defense even had to present their side of the story, the judge dismissed all the charges against Shrien Dewani. The reason? The evidence from the prosecution was, in the judge's words, insufficient
and just too unreliable to ever lead to a conviction. Shreen walked out a free man. So legally, the case was done. But for everyone involved, and especially for Annie's family, the emotional fallout, it was just beginning. The verdict left behind so many more questions than answers. And this is the question that still haunts this whole case, isn't it? I mean, sure, 3 men were convicted for actually carrying out the hijacking and the murder, but the man they accused of planning it all, he was acquitted. So it leaves this painful void. What was the real motive for killing Anni? After the trial, the 2 families were left in these starkly different realities. Anni's family was just devastated. They felt that justice was completely denied and that they'd never really know the full story of what happened to their daughter. Anni Dewani, he went back to his life in the UK, saying he was relieved but also deeply sad for the loss of his wife. So, what does a case like this leave us with? Well, it's this powerful, tragic example that really put the justice system under a microscope. It sparked a huge debate about relying on testimony from accomplices. You know, the guys who cut deals to save themselves. That was the prosecution's whole strategy, and it crumbled. But even more than that, it's a story about how narratives can be built up and then totally torn down inside a courtroom. But, beyond all the legal drama and the media frenzy, the most important thing to take away is the memory of Anni herself. It is just so crucial to remember that behind all those headlines was a real person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, whose life was just cut tragically, violently short. Even now, more than a decade later, the murder of Anni Dewani feels unresolved for so many people. Her story is just this heartbreaking reminder of a life that was so full of promise, a life that was violently extinguished, leaving this trail of grief and so many unanswered questions that stretch all the way from Sweden and the UK to South Africa.